Well, let me begin by saying what an incredible honor it is to be up here in front of all of you, and especially after those remarkable speeches that came before. It's a lot to live up to. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be talking to people who are involved in organizing labor for some of, I think, the most underappreciated workers in our world. I'm excited to be here talking to all of you tonight. Even in purely non-religious terms, homosexuality represents a misuse of the sexual faculty. It is a pathetic little second-rate substitute for reality, a pitiable flight from life. As such, it deserves no glamorization, no rationalization, and above all, no pretense that it is anything but a pernicious sickness. That's Time magazine in 1966, when I was 3 years old. And as all of you know, last spring the Supreme Court found in favor of gay marriage. And I set out on an investigation to try to understand how that happened. How did we get from there to here? How did we get from a world in which everyone believed that homosexuality was an illness to one in which gayness was an identity? And if that could happen for gay people, then who else was there out there who had a condition that got treated as an illness that might instead be treated as an identity? When I was, I think, about 6 years old, I went with my mother and my brother to a shoe store. And when we finished getting our shoes, the salesman said that we could each have a balloon to take home. And my brother wanted a red balloon, and I wanted a pink balloon. And my mother said that she thought I'd really rather have a blue balloon. And I said, no, I really wanted the pink balloon. And she reminded me that my favorite color was blue. So the fact that my favorite color now is blue, but I'm still gay, will give you some sense of a mother's influence and its limits. When I was growing up, my mother used to say all the time, the love for your children is like no other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. And when I was very little and she said that, I took it as this great compliment. It meant that bringing up my brother and me was one of the joys of her life. And when I was an adolescent and she said it, it made me anxious because I thought, but I think I might be gay. And if I'm gay, I probably won't be able to have children. And after I came out in my early 20s, it made me really angry. And I would say, you know that's not the path I'm on, and I want you to stop saying that. But she never did. The love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. Some 20 years ago, my editors at the New York Times asked me to write a piece about deaf culture. And I was very taken aback. I had thought deafness was a tragedy. Those poor people, they couldn't hear. What could we do for them? It had never occurred to me that it was a culture. And then I went out into the deaf world. The first person I met was Jackie Roth, whom you saw in the video earlier, the deaf woman who opened the video. And I began having experiences in that deaf world. I went to deaf theater. I went into households where the alarm clock flashed a light instead of making a sound. I began to see how people were united in their use of sign language. I even went to the Miss Deaf America contest, which was in Nashville, Tennessee that year, where everyone complained about the slurry Southern signing. And as I immersed myself deeper and deeper in the deaf world, I recognized that it really was a culture. And the moment when I fully understood that was when I walked into a meeting of the National Association of the Deaf, and I was in a room quite like this room, but with the lights very bright because you need a lot of light for deaf people to communicate and see each other across the room, and everyone was signing, and they were all rushing toward one another, and I thought, I wish I were deaf. which is not to say that I wished I couldn't hear, because my hearing is very useful to me. But I saw that in that room there was a certain intimacy that existed among all of those deaf people, and they were all part of something, and though I could spend years trying to learn ASL, I was never really going to be part of it. And I felt othered, and it made me think about how othered those deaf people felt over and over and over again when they went to Christmas with their hearing families, or they did something else with the hearing community. And it was a shocking moment of revelation for me. And then I found out that most deaf children are in fact born to hearing parents. That those hearing parents, at least historically, have tried to make their children function in what they think of as the real world, the hearing world. And that a lot of those deaf kids have found deaf identity only in adolescence or thereafter, when it comes as a great revelation to them. And I thought how similar that was to the experience of gay kids, who are mostly born to straight parents, who mostly, time out of mind, have tried to get their kids to function in what they think of as the real world, the normal world. And I thought how strange it was to look at how those gay people, too, often stumbled into gay culture in adolescence when it came to them as some kind of great revelation. And then a friend of mine had a daughter who was a dwarf. And she suddenly began asking all of these questions, which by now felt very familiar. Do I bring her up to think she's just like everyone else, but kind of short? Or do I need to throw myself into the little people of America and try to give her some kind of dwarf identity? And how on earth am I going to do that, given that I'm not a dwarf? And as she narrated her bewilderment, I thought, there it is again. There it is again, a family that thinks of itself as essentially normal, with a child whom they think of as abnormal in some profound way. And so I began on an idea that became central to my whole investigation, that there are really two kinds of identity out there. There are what I've called vertical identities that get passed down generation to generation. So your ethnicity is usually a vertical identity, often your religion, often your nationality. These are all things that you're likely to have in common with your parents, and some of them are really hard. You can look at the United States as it's currently constructed and say that for all of the good work that's been done, much of it by people in this room, that it is still easier in the United States to be white than it is to be a person of color. That's what we've been talking about. But nobody has suggested that the correct response to that is to investigate genetic research that will allow the next generation of children born to Asian or Latino or African American parents to come out with blonde hair and blue eyes. We recognize that the problem is in the society, and that what we need to change is the society. And then there are what I've called horizontal identities. Horizontal because you don't learn them from your mother and father or your grandparents. You have to learn them from your peer group, from the other people you're with, because they're things you don't have in common with your parents. So being gay, being deaf, being a dwarf, having Down syndrome or autism or schizophrenia or multiple severe disabilities. I looked at families of prodigies and geniuses because though having a genius is essentially less sad than having a child with some of these other challenges, it's not actually any easier. It's very confusing. I looked at families in which women were bringing up children conceived in rape, because for those women, often their relationship to their child is defined by a sense of that child's identity that the child, him or herself, may not learn about until much later on. And I looked at families of people who commit crimes, because it seemed to me, when we look into the justice system, that while we have stopped blaming parents for so many of these other conditions, we don't say you're autistic because you have a refrigerator cold mother, and we don't say you're gay because you have an overbearing mother. We still say that it's somehow the fault of the parents, and especially the fault of the mother, if your child has ended up in prison, and there is a lot of judgment that gets passed. So how did that inflect the dynamic? And I looked at families of people who were transgender. And those were the categories I looked at. And as I looked at them, I was really struck by a divide that I had not previously understood. And that was the divide between love and acceptance. Now, we've all heard stories of incredible cruelty and abuse. A lot of you work in systems in which you encounter bad parenting. But my experience still overall is that most parents love their children. And love is something that ideally starts from the moment a child is born. It grows, it changes, but it's essentially something that's there. It's just natural to the relationship, at least much or most of the time. But acceptance is a process, and it takes time, and it always takes time. It takes time even if your child doesn't have any kind of exceptional identity. And when I understood that, I realized that I had experienced my own parents' lack of acceptance as a lack of love. And my parents actually did accept me. It just took them a little while, the way it takes all parents a little while to accept their children, over and over again. And when I realized that, I felt much more forgiving than I had felt before in connection with my own family. Now, the question of acceptance is a broad question. You have to have self-acceptance, you have to have family acceptance, and you have to have acceptance by the larger society, and each one of those things feeds the others. So if you live in a really accepting society, you're going to have a much easier time dealing with a child who's different. But if your child who's different is really self-assured, that child can convince you to accept him or her and can convince the larger society to accept people who are like him or her. It's a form of collective bargaining. Now, I'm going to tell you about some of the people I encountered while I was working on this book, and I'll start with Clinton Brown, who was the dwarf you saw in the video. When Clinton was born, his mother was actually told that he wasn't going to live for very long and that she might as well leave him in the hospital so he could die quietly. And as he said, she thought about it for 3 days before she actually saw him. And then she said, "That's my child, and I'm going to take my child home," she said, "and I'm going to do my best, and if he just dies in a few months, at least I'll know I tried." And so she took him home, and when he was about a year old, she saw a television program on which they interviewed a doctor who worked a lot with dwarfs, who was down at Johns Hopkins. And even though she didn't have a lot of resources, educational or economic, she managed to get Clint down from Long Island, where they lived, to Johns Hopkins. And she took him in to see Dr. Kopitz. And there was something she told me about that first encounter that's always stayed with me. She said we had seen one doctor after the next with Clint, and everyone said, "You'll never be able to do this, he'll never be able to do that, you're going to have this problem, you're going to have that problem." She said, we walked into Dr. Kopitz's office, and he picked Clint up in his hands and said, "Let me tell you, that's going to be a handsome young man one day." That question of how you frame things, of how you present things, can be transformative. And she said it was the beginning of the change. And in the course of his childhood, Clint had, as he said in the video, 30 major surgical procedures. That's a lot of surgery. And some of them were spinal surgeries in which he had to be completely immobilized for as much as 3 months at a time. And while he was stuck endlessly in that hospital room, he figured there was nothing else much to do. So he did his schoolwork, and he did it really well. In fact, he did it better than anyone in his family ever had before. And he became the first member of his family to go to college. And when he got to college, he joined a fraternity, and he lived on campus, and he had a specially fitted car that he could drive that accommodated his tiny frame. And he went not very far from where his parents lived. And one day his mother called me, and she said, "I was driving home from work, and I went past a bar, and there was Clinton's car parked outside a bar." She said, and I thought to myself, he's 3 feet tall, they're 6 feet tall, 2 beers for them is 4 beers for him. I wanted to go in there and interrupt, but I knew I couldn't do that. So I went home and I left him 11 messages on his voicemail. She said, and then I thought, if someone had told me when he was born that my future worry was going to be that he would go drinking and driving with his college buddies, I'd have been so thrilled to have that problem. And I said, "What do you think you did What do you think you did that allowed this child, for whom there seemed to be only misery ahead when he was born, about whom everyone said all of these things, how did you get him to turn out as this happy, well-adjusted, popular, accomplished person? I said, what on earth did you do? And she said, what did we do? We loved him, that's all. Clinton just always had that light in him, and we were fortunate enough to be the first to see it there. I'm pleased to tell you that Clinton recently got engaged and is soon to be married. So give it up for Clinton. I'll tell you about another dwarf I got to know. This is a little girl named Kiki Peck. She lives in Michigan. She has something called kinese dysplasia, which means that the cartilage didn't develop. It means she has sort of rheumatic limbs, as if she had arthritis as a tiny child. Her eyes didn't develop correctly, and she doesn't see very well. She has all kinds of problems in addition to her small stature. But she has a quality about her, every time I've met her, of exuberance and joy. And her mother, who was very attached to her, was diagnosed with breast cancer when Kiki was 8. And her mother called her children in and said, look, I've had this diagnosis. I think I'm going to be fine. I'm going to have some surgery. I'm going to have some treatment. Because the chemotherapy would make me lose my hair, I'm going to shave my head before I start. And Kiki said, I'll help you shave your head. And her mother said, okay. So Kiki helped her mother shave her head. And when she was finished, she said, and now I'm going to shave my head. And her mother said, Kiki, what are you talking about? Why on earth would you do that? And Kiki said, I've spent a lot of time being different all by myself, and I know how lonely it can be, and I would like for you to have someone else who's different the same way you are at the same time. This is a child of 8. When you look at those stories, what you come away with is not, oh, these kids turned out okay even though they had dwarfism. What you come away with is these kids developed on the basis of that difficult challenge in ways that are absolutely extraordinary and that almost certainly wouldn't have happened in the same fashion otherwise. I'm going to quote to you from one more magazine from the 1960s. This is the Atlantic Monthly in 1968, written a journal at that time of liberal opinion by a well-known ethicist. Joseph Fletcher said, there is no reason to feel guilty about putting a Down syndrome child away, whether it is put away in the sense of hidden in a sanitarium or in a more responsible, lethal sense. It is sad, yes, dreadful, but it carries no guilt. True guilt arises only from an offense against a person, and a Downs is not a person. There's been a lot of news coverage of the changing attitude toward gay rights. It's in the papers every day. There's been less attention given to the fact that we are changing our attitude toward difference altogether. The reason that those lines, which were perfectly unexceptional in 1968, caused a lot of people to make unhappy sounds just now when I recited them, is that we as a society have come to different expectations. Don't get me wrong, we have a long way to go. There's so much that's still a mess, but there is progress going on, and it's important that we take note of that progress and that we recognize that that progress has come in part because so many of those people who were different in so many ways and couldn't quite win voices individually for themselves managed to get those voices through the interventions of others and through finding a collective sense of identity. Now, people with Down syndrome now live almost twice as long as they did when that article was published. They have arrived at educational achievements that were previously unimaginable. Some have jobs, some live semi-independently. Many of them have more advanced use of language than people used to think was even imaginable. And I have been very struck by the changes that's brought about, but also by the changes in visibility. And visibility counts. Over and over again, visibility counts It counts in Black Lives Matter, it counts in Dwarf Lives Matter, it counts in Down syndrome lives, it counts in every kind of life that matters, because lives matter. So in looking at the situation of people with Down syndrome, someone I know went out to lunch. She had worked for years with people with disabilities, with the actress who appeared on the show Glee in LA. And she said people were coming over to ask her for her autograph. She was a celebrity first and a person with a disability second. I never dreamed I would live to see that day. I got to know a family named Tom and Karen Robards. When their son was born with Down syndrome, their son David, they were very much in the thick of their lives. They were young, they were ambitious, they were trying to work in banking, and suddenly their lives changed right in front of them. And they realized as their son got older that they didn't like the educational opportunities available to him. This would have been the late 70s. And so they got together with a few other families, and they persuaded the Archdiocese of New York to give them 2 unused public lavatories that they converted into classrooms. And they hired a teacher to teach their kids, because they had realized that separate education is never equal education, and there was no integrated education for people with intellectual disabilities at that time. And that little thing they started with those 2 classrooms has since grown into something called the Cook Center, at which untold tens of thousands of people with intellectual disabilities have been educated, and where some of the revelations that have helped people with Down syndrome to live so much better, where some of those things have been worked out and figured out, and where the whole system of education has been changed. And I said to them, look, this has been your life. I said, do you regret it? Do you wish your son didn't have Down syndrome? And Tom Robards, the father, said, well, for David, I wish he didn't have it because it's a difficult way to be in the world. And I'd like to give David an easier life. But I really think if we lost everyone with Down syndrome from the world, it would be a real and catastrophic loss. And his mother, Karen, said, you know, for David, I guess I would cure it if I could, because I too would like to give David an easier and better life. She said, but speaking for myself, well, I would never have believed when he was born that I could come to such a point I have. For him, I'd change it in a minute, but for me, it has given me so much richer, so much more engaged, so much more purposeful a life than I would ever have had otherwise. But speaking for myself, I wouldn't exchange these experiences for anything in the world. Now, we live in a time of amazing medical progress, of amazing social progress. We live in a time in which there is this broad acceptance, in which there are more and more opportunities for people who are deaf, or people who are dwarfs, or people who have Down syndrome. But we also live in a time of medical progress. Cochlear implants, a device that can be surgically implanted in the brain and connected to a receiver, allow people who are born deaf, many of them, to achieve a reasonable version of hearing. There is a compound called BMN 111, which was tried in rats. It blocks the action of the gene that causes the most common form of dwarfism. It's now being used in children who appear to be growing to a typical height instead of remaining dwarfs. And there are more and more blood tests that allow for testing earlier and earlier in pregnancies for people who want to terminate pregnancies with children with Down syndrome or other anomalies. And I believe in social progress, and I believe in medical progress, but I sometimes feel they're on a kind of collision course. And sometimes when I go to these situations, the meeting of the National Association of the Deaf, the Little People of America, to visit the Cook Center and look at what they're doing, I feel like I'm at one of those operas where the hero realizes he loves the heroine at the exact moment that she dies on a sofa. That question of what it means to change and to cure things really hinges on a sort of basic question. In any of the situations I've been talking about, there is an inherent difficulty. I mean, Kiki Peck has rheumatic joints. Nobody wants to have rheumatic joints. Those are painful. Kiki Peck has trouble with her eyes. We all want to be able to see as well as we can. But Kiki Peck also is the object of teasing and bullying because she's really little. When something is actually physically or medically or constitutionally painful, I mean, schizophrenia is not physical in quite the same way, but schizophrenic visions are mostly hellish. Very few people, some, but very few people with schizophrenia say that it's a lot of fun having those delusions. If you have a situation that is inherently painful, then the correct approach to it is a medical one. How can we eliminate that suffering? But all of these things have got a problem which is social. If the problem with being deaf is that you don't have interpretive services anywhere and you can't explain to your doctor what's wrong, that isn't something that needs to be cured by giving you hearing. That's something that needs to be cured by providing the services so that you can function in the community and in the world. And in all of these situations, you have to delineate what is actually the medical piece of it and what is the social piece of it. And you have to avoid coming up with medical solutions to social problems. I'm going to quote to you from an autism activist named Jim Sinclair. He doesn't have the use of spoken language, but he does write. And he has not written very much, but what he's written is very powerful. And he said, "When parents say, 'I wish my child did not have autism,' what they're really saying is, 'I wish the autistic child I have did not exist, and I had a different, non-autistic child instead.'" Read that again. This is what we hear when you mourn over our existence. This is what we know when you pray for a cure. That your fondest wish is that someday we will cease to be, and strangers you can love will move in behind our faces. Now that's a very extreme point of view, but I've gotten to know a lot of people with autism, and a lot of them don't want to be cured, and a lot of them have been traumatized by cures which are very costly, not just economically costly, but emotionally costly, socially costly, costly in the dynamics of the family, and often not very successful in any case. There is one mother who has a daughter who has spoken 3 times. Cece said nothing until she was 6, and then one day she was watching TV with her parents, and her father stood up and turned off the television. And Cece suddenly said, "I want the television on." And her parents looked at each other and waited for their world to change. 3 more years went by, and Cece was at school, and there was a play at school. And someone in the play said, "What color is the king's robe?" And Cece said, "It's bright purple." So as her mother, Betsy, said to me, to have a child who's never spoken is to think, well, maybe she doesn't know what's going on, maybe she doesn't know what language is, maybe she hasn't understood anything that's happened. But to have a child who's spoken 3 times is to spend your whole life wondering how the traffic jam cleared then, and what else is in her head waiting to come out, and why it is that it never comes out otherwise. And she described pursuing these endless kinds of treatment. She said, "I felt like I'd done everything." She said, "All I hadn't done was go to Lourdes." She said, "I had tried everything there was to try." And she said, "Finally, I realized Cece is the Zen lesson." Why does Cece have autism? Because Cece has autism. And what is it like to be Cece? Being Cece. Because no one else is, and we'll never know what it's like. It is what it is, and it isn't anything else. And maybe you'll never change it. And maybe you should stop trying. I was amazed by all these stories I heard of people who had managed to find some positive way to spin the experiences they were having of great difficulty. Now, in the first place, I should say, not everyone can do that, and not everyone does do that. There are many, many stories of people who don't end up feeling incredibly grateful. And I also should say that even these people who ended up finding meaning in their experiences went through a lot of pain. They went through a huge amount of pain and difficulty. But that question of how you value a child whom the larger society devalues, That thing that you were talking about before, the child for whom you're not supposed to stand up, your mother holds you back. How do you end up valuing a child like that? And I saw no more extreme example of this issue than when I went to interview the parents of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine Massacre in 1999, the worst school shooting in history on which so many since then have been modeled or based. And I went off, and it had taken me years to persuade the Klebolds to talk to me. They hadn't ever told their story. And then when they finally agreed to it, they were so full of the story that they couldn't stop telling it. And what I remember was the first weekend I spent with them, we had recorded 20 hours of interviews. And Sunday night we were sitting in the kitchen and we were all exhausted. And I said, if Dylan were here now, is there anything you'd want to ask him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And Sue Klebold looked at the floor, and she thought for a minute. And then she looked up and she said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. A few years later, at one of many dinners that I had with Sue and Tom after that, it was just Sue and me that evening, I reminded her of that conversation, and she said, you know, I used to wish that I had never met Tom. If I hadn't gone to Ohio State, which is where she went, we would never have crossed paths, and these children wouldn't have existed, and this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. She said, but over time, I've come to feel that I love the children I had so much that I don't want to imagine a life without them, even at the price of this pain. When I say that, I'm talking about my own pain, of course, not that of other people. But life is full of suffering, and this is mine. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I believe it would not have been better for me. And I thought, how can that possibly be? How can you possibly not wish that you'd had a different child instead? That was the point of view that I arrived with. But I would bet that if some glorious angel dropped through the ceiling of the Crowne Plaza ballroom here and offered everyone in this room the opportunity, all of those who are parents, to turn in their children for some kind of other, better children who were more attractive and more intelligent and more friendly, that everybody would cling to the children they have and pray away that atrocious spectacle. Because the reality is that we not only take care of our children because we love them, we also love them because we take care of them. And that process of taking care is immensely bonding and draws people immensely close together. And these children, the children I'm talking about, required more care than most children. And the care that they required sometimes frightens parents off. There are parents who can't deal with it, and there are parents who shouldn't be asked to deal with it because it's beyond them. But for the parents who can deal with it and who do deal with it, often it builds this incredible tightness and intimacy. Now, I'm going to tell you about two women who, to me, summed up the process around this. One of them is the mother of two children with multiple very severe disabilities. When the first child was born, they were told that it was a genetic fluke and that they should go ahead and have other children. They had a second child who was fine, and then a third who had the same syndrome as the first. They never learned to speak. They never were able to walk. They were both blind. They were really very, very compromised in many ways. And one of them, they stayed at home, I guess. They stayed with their parents for as long as possible. But of course, people who don't have any control over their locomotion are very heavy and difficult to move around. There are people in this room who've done this and who know how hard they can be to move around. And eventually, after Sarah Haddon herniated a disc trying to pick one of the kids up out of a bathtub, they decided that they would put them in a group home. And so they went into a group home, and they seemed to do very well in the group home. And then one day, the younger child was being given a bath, and the person giving him a bath left the room to get a towel, and the harness he was in hadn't been fastened correctly, and he slipped under the water and he drowned. when I talked to the parents after this had happened, I said, "What did you do? And what did you say?" And Sarah said, in the first place, she said, "I went over there," she said, and I mean, she was in deep grief, but she said, and I said to the person taking care of her, "It could have been any of us." She said, "It's so hard to be vigilant all the time." She said, and then all these people said to me, "Are you going to sue the group home, or are you going to sue the state?" She said, "The work that these people do, taking care of children like ours, is such difficult work, and they are paid so little to do it." She said, and I didn't want to do anything that would discourage other people from going into that line of work. So I went to the internment of her son's ashes, which took place a year after he died. And at the graveside she said, "Let me bury here the rage I feel to have been twice robbed. Once of the child I wanted, and once of the son I loved." Another mother who also had two children with multiple very severe disabilities and truncated life expectancies said to me, "You know, people always give us these little sayings like, God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. But children like ours are not preordained as a gift. They're a gift because that's what we have chosen." And that was what I found, was that it is a choice. It's not a choice everyone can make, and it is not an easy choice. But it is a choice to find a way to become grateful for a life you would have done anything to avoid. And that choice has an enormous effect on the happiness. It reminds me of what you were saying about the effect on both the enslaved and the slave owner, that if you can actually say, my child's life has meaning, that gives your child a better life, and it gives you a better life too. Because as long as you live close to anyone and discount their life as being too damaged to have full meaning, you yourself are compromised by that contact and by that interaction. When I started this work, I looked at mainstreaming programs, and I thought, okay, this mainstreaming business is really great for disabled kids because they end up in a classroom with non-disabled kids and they get better access to education and more exposure to the world they'll have to live in. And I thought, on the other hand, it's kind of a nuisance for the non-disabled kids who get slowed down so much. And having now spent a lot of time in mainstreaming classrooms, I think that what the non-disabled children learn by way of lessons in humanity ends up being of more value to them and to the society at large than whatever it is that the disabled people are able to get from sharing that classroom. And I think that those mainstreaming programs, that educational programs in which people are mixed together and have to recognize one another's humanity, are the only positive way to go. Now, I know that this is a labor union, and I feel like this issue of fully acknowledging the humanity of people who are different in those ways also is involved in the acknowledgement by people who have got more privilege of the value of the contributions that are made by people who have less privilege. That if we want to get to a point at which everyone has come to the reasonable position that $15 an hour is a bare minimum, we need to recognize humanity in the broadest possible way. The American poet Emma Lazarus, who's best known for her poem on the Statue of Liberty, said, "Until we are all free, we are none of us free." And that's the message that I took from these encounters. Now, I decided to have children while I was working on this project, and various people said to me, "How can you be deciding to have children in the middle of a book about everything that can go wrong?" And I said over and over again, but it's not a book about everything that can go wrong. It's a book about how much joy there can be in the experience, even when everything seems to be going wrong. And so I will explain my family in the most condensed way I can. My husband is the biological father of two children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. One of my good friends who had gotten divorced but wanted to have kids, and I decided we'd have a child together. So I have a daughter, and mother and daughter live in Fort Worth, Texas. And my husband and I then wanted to have a child we could bring up ourselves, and so we have our son George, of whom I am the biological father. We had an egg donor, and our surrogate was Laura, the lesbian mother of his 2 biological children. So the shorthand is 5 parents, 4 children, 3 states. And there seem to be people who think that the existence of families such as mine somehow undermines the integrity of families such as theirs, and I don't accept those subtractive models of love, only additive ones. And I believe that in the same way that we need to keep up species diversity to sustain the planet, that we need to keep up this diversity of love and family and life and experience to sustain the ecosphere of kindness. Now, the day after my son was born was, of course, a happy and joyful day. We were all in the hospital in Minneapolis, and the pediatrician came in, and she said she was concerned. And I said, "Oh." And she said, "He's not extending his legs correctly." And I said, "Oh." And she said, "That could indicate severe neurological damage." She said, "And insofar as he's doing it asymmetrically, which suggests the possibility of a mass in his brain, and also he has a very large head and should be tested for hydrocephalus." And I felt my whole self draining out onto the floor, and I thought, I've been writing this book about all these people who found all this meaning in these difficult experiences, and I do not want to join their number. And as we went to the MRI machine and the CAT scanner and the other X-ray and for the arterial blood draw and for all of this other testing, I found myself really despairing. And I thought, well, I'm despairing because it's quite possible he has a really severe illness. And I want to protect my child from illness the way that all parents want to protect their children from illness. But I also realized at some point as we were wandering around there, I thought, but if he really has one of these things, it's going to be his identity. And if it's his identity, it's going to be my identity too. And I suddenly heard this voice in my ear that said, the love for your children is unlike any other feeling in the world. And until you have children, you don't know what it feels like. At the end of 4 hours, I'm pleased to say that the pediatrician called us in and told us that George was now extending his legs fine and all the scans were clear. And when I asked her what she thought had been going on in the morning, she said she thought he had probably had a cramp. But I had fallen in love with children, I think, most deeply in that moment when I suddenly understood that fatherhood meant being open to loss. I'd never have noticed that if I hadn't been doing the research I was. But for so long, I'd met all of these parents, and I thought that they were kind of inspiring fools who were somehow trying to will their difficult experiences into meaning, to somehow make the journey with their children into a beautiful one, with these children who seemed so miserable and so sad. And I thought, how can they do that? How can they sail on with all of this good hope and cheer around these difficult topics? And that day, in that hospital in Minneapolis, I suddenly found that my research had built me a plank, and that I too was ready to join them on their ship. Thank you.